I just wanted to thank everybody for coming and especially thank Jodi for um, being willing to present about this and talk about it all. It is going to be a pretty casual yet extremely packed session, so feel free to interrupt if you have a question like during the presentation, and we'll just keep things rolling. It is going to be recorded, so if you need to drop out or leave early or anything like that, you can watch the video afterwards and I'll send it out. Um, so yeah, just thank you for coming, and I'll turn things over to Jodi.
Hi, all. Thanks for having me. The one thing I would say is that I did try to pack a good bit into this, and I don't know if we'll have time for a full Q&A at the end. So truly, I mean it. Just interrupt me. I have no problem with that. Stop me if you have a question. And if it's okay with you, I'll leave it to you to sort of monitor that because I may not be able to, um, fully like clock that someone has a question. But by all means, just ping me and I'll stop. Um, the first thing I want to say about this is what I'm talking about today is a very specific sort of activism. You can go ahead to the next one. It's around issue advocacy. So, there's all kinds of activism. There are people who are engaged in, explicitly electoral work. There are people who do boycotts and, larger coordinated actions. And there's just sort of no way for us to focus on all of that. So I pulled out the things that I think are probably kind of the top items people tend to have the most questions about and require the most of you. So, signing a petition, you don't really need to know too much. You just sort of sign on the line. Engaging in a day of action, you just kind of tweet whatever you're told to tweet. And, it's not that those things aren't helpful, but they're not, they don't require as much agency and knowledge for each individual person. So I really tried to focus in on the pieces of activism and advocacy that are a little bit more, require a little bit more understanding and work on everyone's part. So just a context issue there. Okay, go ahead. So starting off with the 3 A's of advocacy, I think we all know about awareness, right? We're almost, I would say, in some ways, beyond awareness. There's when advocacy started, when advocacy started, it's always existed. But when people were engaging in it in recent decades, before the advent of social media, there was less opportunity to make people aware. Now, I think people are generally aware. What we need to do is push them toward action. So once people are aware of the issue we care about, we're pushing them to do something about it. Let their family and friends know, and not just know, but sort of ask them to do something, write a letter, call, visit your elected officials, become a member of Bike Pittsburgh, volunteer at one of your events, do something, give money. There are multiple ways to take action, but we really want people to move from awareness to action. And then what happens after action is you win. Sometimes you hope you win. You can't win if you don't try. So at least there's a shot. Taking action advances a movement or can affect a policy change. And that's what we're trying to get to here. Go ahead. We might have to click a couple times. Okay, so really what advocacy is about, what activism is about, is understanding and building power. There are 2 types of power. There's organized money and organized people. And most of us who engage in advocacy and activism don't have the former, we have the latter. So we need to know how to organize people so that we can have agency and move toward the outcome we're seeking without endless funds to make it happen, which a lot of times, just by nature of sort of what advocacy looks like, people are up against moneyed power and, trying to fight an institution or a movement that has more resources than we do. So it's really important to understand the 2 types of power and understand that we need to build power in order to make change. Go ahead. One thing I just want to hit on, this is not really so much part of what I'm going to talk about today, but it's really important to everything that I do and that Sequel does as a firm, and that's trying to think about equity and inclusion in everything we do. So when advocating on any issue, those with the most to lose generally have the least amount of power. And that's something that we just always try and keep in mind. And if at all possible, we center the leadership and voices of marginalized communities. So in other words, those who are most affected deserve the voice. We should not be speaking for people. And we try really hard not to do that. We don't always succeed, but it is our effort to center frontline communities, folks who are most affected. So, obviously this is an ongoing process. And we all learn, we all grow and adapt and do better. We're not perfect either, but just wanted to kind of hit on that real quick. So one of the things to think about as an advocate is that you may be the person who is visiting with your state representative or the mayor or a corporate entity or anyone that you're sort of trying to get something from. You will know more about the issue you're advocating on because you are the expert. You're the person who's there, who cares about this issue. Most lawmakers and reporters, we will also talk a lot about using the media to your advantage here, are generalists. So they see, thousands of bills in a year. They may know a little bit about the issue. They may have a general idea if they're for or against something. They are not going to have the specifics. And a lot of times when people say to me, "Oh, I don't know, I can't lobby. I don't know everything about this bill." You know what you need to know. You know that you care about this issue, and that's enough. The other thing is that when one person goes and talks to their representative or sends an email or signs a petition, that representative can then assume that there are multiple people of you. You're just the one who sort of took it to the next level. So you are always representing a group of people who feel this way, and that influences decision makers and thought leaders. And that's why it matters not to just be aware, but to actually take action. So there's tons of types of advocacy, as I talked about earlier. The three that we're going to talk about today, I put in red: lobby visits, personal interaction with an elected, calling and emailing electeds, and using the media to advance your agenda. Obviously, forums and town halls and writing letters and doing postcards and protests and rallies and boycotts and all of these other items are also useful tools. But there's just no way to fit in talking about each one of them during, while you eat lunch. So if any of you is interested and wants to, focus in on some of these other issues, I think maybe Anna and I can talk about potentially doing a follow-up session or a second session. But the three that are highlighted here are the three I'm going to focus on. That said, if anyone has a question about any of these other items, maybe mention it now and we'll quickly touch on it and then move on. Okay. Okay. So the one thing I want to say about this is the idea of this, the idea of sort of lobbying your legislator. And by the way, lobbying can be a 501c3 activity. This is not, we're not talking about going and telling anyone who to vote for. This is, caring about a particular issue and wanting to see a change in policy, and that is completely permissible as a charity organization. One of the kind of context issues here is that I did not start talking about this or create this presentation initially in the middle of a global pandemic when we couldn't go anywhere or do anything in person. So I've tried to adjust this a little bit. But it does still kind of ring of being able to go to a legislator's office and have a conversation with them. So I guess just think about how this might change over Zoom, and hope that in the next few months we can go back to doing normal things like that. So when you are lobbying a legislator, persuading a policymaker, It is really important to be prepared with a script, but you all know about this issue, you care about this issue, you should be able to speak to it without reading. If you can be as specific as possible, so stick to one issue. We don't want to kind of come in there with a whole agenda full of information. I want this thing, and I want my neighborhood to change this way, and I want this bill to pass. Pick a thing, focus on that, and then contact them a second time, for another policy or another issue area. One thing I will say is that generally speaking, it takes 50 to 60 contacts of a legislator or policymaker to affect an issue. So there are plenty of opportunities for you to come back and take a second bite at the apple, but really try and stick to one issue when you have a visit or a call. Urge action and accountability. This is a big one, and people ask about it all the time. Contact only your own lawmaker. It is not helpful to call a senator in Utah, who sits on a committee that, sits on transportation, for example, because that person only cares about their constituents. And in fact, if you have too many folks who are focused on contacting legislators of other areas, you can actually, clog up the lines and kind of drain and diffuse the voices that do come from constituencies. So really important to just contact your own lawmaker, even though sometimes that feels frustrating if you have a lawmaker who isn't with you, and or is with you, and you're like, what's the point? This person is always going to support this. That's true, and so then go back to getting your friends and family activated rather than focusing so much on your own policymaker. Personal narrative. There are no facts, figures, statistics that will move anyone as much as a personal story. If you don't have a personal story, try and bring one with you from someone else who you are there representing. So again, you're one of many. You may be the person who has the flexibility to take a meeting, but there's someone else who is affected who can't be there, and talk about their personal story if you can. Ideally, it's your own narrative, obviously. It's fine to be there as part of Bike Pittsburgh, as part of a coalition. There's no need to pretend that you're there just as an individual person and you're not connected. Organizing is power. Being part of an organization is powerful. It's meaningful. Again, it reflects that there are many people who care about this issue, so it's totally fine to be open about that. We'll talk about messaging in a bit. Be constructive and polite. There are some policymakers who are very frustrating humans. I think we can all agree on that. But getting angry with them in the moment, just is not going to move your issue forward. So difficult as it can be, it is important to try and maintain some decorum while doing this. Always have something to leave behind. In this case, it's probably more like sending a letter or an email, which we'll talk about in a moment. But if you are meeting in person, creating a fact sheet or a pamphlet or something that they can have with them that has some of the facts and issues that you talked about is always helpful. Am I missing questions?
Yeah, there was one question, just kind of clarifying the 50 to 60 contacts. Does it matter if it's one person, or do you mean like 60 different people?
No, I mean like hearing from 50 or 60 people about an issue. I mean, I take that with a grain of salt, right? Like if you're one person and you go in and you have an extremely compelling story and you have a lawmaker who is open to hearing that story, that's not, this isn't ground in stone that they'll never move. Generally speaking, though, when things happen, like staff counts how many folks have called on the phone, how many emails have they gotten, how many people care about an issue, it's 50 to 60 contacts before they sort of register it as something that the lawmaker needs to worry about.
Gotcha. Thank you. Any other questions before we move
on? Following up. So again, kind of assuming that you had an in-person meeting or maybe, a Zoom gathering, sending a follow-up thank you letter or email, summarize your position, reassert what you're asking them to do. So demanding accountability from them. This is not just a meeting for you to talk at someone. They are representing you, and you're asking them to take a stance on an issue or get a bill passed or co-sponsor something. There's an actual ask involved. It's always fine, and this is true with the media as well, which I'll touch on, always fine to say you don't know the answer to something and you'll get back to them. We never want to lie or make stuff up, even though sometimes it feels like that's what we should do so that we don't look silly. But it really is better just to be honest and say, I don't know the answer to that. I'll get back to you. And again, just, asking for a response and accountability. Go ahead. Before I move on to media, any questions or concerns around, lobbying policymakers?
Nothing's coming in the chat, so.
Okay. So one of the key ways that we can change policymaker minds, we can change policy, we can enact the sort of changes in systems that we want is by utilizing the media. A lot of people think, why would I want to do a press interview? The media are terrible. They're just going to hound me. They lie, all of these things, right? Well, the media exists, whether we want them to exist or not. Hopefully we do. And they're going to tell the stories they're going to tell. So the best thing that we can do is interact with those stories so that we can influence the story that comes out. And one thing to remember about the media is that you're not talking to the reporter. It's not the outlet. It's not the journalist. It's whatever audience you're trying to reach. So another good way to influence a legislator, particularly if you haven't gotten 60 touches or more, is to have something appear in their local paper that shows them, oh my God, someone cares about this enough to have written a story or to written a letter about it. That must mean it matters. It also, but it doesn't have to be just one target. You can also be talking to the public. The best way to do all of that is through the media. Go ahead. So one thing I tell people all the time, and it's a tough thing to kind of stick in everyone's brain, mine included, is that when you are talking to a reporter, your role is not to answer that reporter's questions. Your role is to deliver your message. You're literally using the media as a tool to get your messaging out to the public. So a reporter can ask you all kinds of things, and you have to think about, why am I doing this? What issue am I trying to change? What policy am I trying to change by agreeing to do this interview? And you need to be prepared with those 2 or 3 things in your mind that you're going to talk about and you're going to keep answering. It's always okay to ask a reporter to repeat the question or request to start over. In fact, it's a really great trick when you're doing an interview. If you need a moment to gather yourself, you can ask the reporter, hey, could you repeat that question? And while the reporter's repeating that question, in your mind, think about how you're going to answer it. Never say no comment. You just want to repeat your messaging. And I'll be honest, this is awkward, right? Like the first couple of times you do it, you're going to feel really weird because it's like, Anna, what's your last name? And Anna says, I want bike lanes in every neighborhood across the city, no matter the socioeconomic status of that neighborhood. And it's like, what? That's not what I asked you. But reporters know this. They're used to it. It's what people do all the time, particularly politicians. If you start paying attention to this, you'll notice how little questions actually get answered and how much politicians in particular, who are doing interviews, just say what they want to say. Again, remembering you're the expert, not the reporter. Reporters, more and more these days, a generalist. It used to be that reporters had very specific beats and maybe would know a ton about transit. There are still transit reporters in Pittsburgh who cover these issues primarily, but they also cover a lot of other issues. The fact that you care enough to do an interview about this means that you know as much on this particular issue as the reporter. Go ahead. Okay, so some do's and don'ts for talking to the media. Again, we're not there to answer questions. We're there to respond to them with our messaging. Again, just like with the legislator, we don't want to lie. We just want to say, you know what, I don't know the answer to that. I'll get back to you. Translate for real people. So, a lot of us who care about particular issues tend to really know a lot of acronyms and a lot of facts and figures, and always keep in mind that on some level you're speaking to the general population. And so if the general population doesn't know what you're talking about, then the interview is not effective. So it's helpful to speak in very short sound bites. It's very helpful to use analogies that create visuals for people. So, this would cost as much as, PNC Park filled with dollar bills, right? So like the more you can talk about something and you can help people create an image, the more clear it is what you're actually talking about. Again, personalizing your narrative, concentrate on 3 points you want to get across. Those are your messages. So I always tell people, okay, if you're doing this interview and you can go back and anything you want it to look like when you're watching it or reading it, it will say, what do you want that to be? What do you want to read when you see this story posted online? What do you want to see when you see it on TV? That's what you have to continue to talk about. Because if you say the same thing over and over again when you're talking to the reporter, when they do the 30-second cut and that's all you get, that's what you're going to be saying. Not going down some path that you have been asked about, and all of a sudden you find yourself saying something like, what, I had 30 seconds and that's what they put there, that's the part of the quote they took. Don't give them that part of the quote, and then you won't have that part of the quote be in it. Again, don't let a hostile question or don't let anything kind of get you angry and flustered. Just go back to your messaging and repeat it again. When you're doing an on-camera interview, just remember, look at the interviewer, not the camera, because again, you're talking to the public, not to the reporter. So one of the key things to do when you're doing particularly live interviews, but this is the case for taped and for print as well, is pivoting or bridging. Acknowledging the question, so reflective listening, right? I hear what you're asking. Bridging, so using a phrase that takes you to something else, and that something else is your message. So these are just, I'm not going to go through them all, but these are just some ways to sort of pivot or flip the question back to your messaging. There are 100 more other than these, but it's really helpful to have something like this in front of you, particularly if you're doing like a phone or an interview, even on Zoom, where you could have a piece of paper underneath your screen, just so that you always have something right in front of you that you're able to say that flips you back to your questions. One note that isn't on here is that you should never utilize the opposition's messaging. We never want to say the thing that the opposition is saying, because that just helps them spread their message. We want to pivot to what we want to say.
Any questions? It's really interesting information. It's a lot to take in. It'd be hard to formulate a question on the spot, but feel free to interrupt if you do.
I'll pop my email in here at the end, so anyone can follow up and ask questions. I'm happy to respond and answer.
Okay, we'll move
on. So the other kind of media that is really useful is what we call earned media. So essentially, if you're not able to get a story written about an event or an issue that you care about, then we encourage you to create your own media. Now, social media is one way to do that. It's not what we're going to talk about today. Today, we're going to talk about letters to the editor and opinion editorials, or sometimes they're called guest columns. Why do we do that? They are one way to control the narrative. So again, we're always trying to get our message out to the public, not the opposition's message. So if we put something in the paper, it uses our narrative, it uses our messaging, and it influences decision making about, in this case, safe streets, traffic calming, whatever it is you're talking about. Honestly, it's not issue specific. We want to we want legislators and decision makers and policymakers seeing in their local outlets that there are people who care about it. I didn't catch that. What is it? Trying to change the Media, yeah, well, I think that's probably another conversation, but yes, that would be good. So again, elected officials regularly read the opinion pages for clues about issues of concern to their community. So that's another reason it's really important to have letters and opinion pieces in the paper. But it's also a great way to reach a really big audience. Even on social media, you're really probably only hitting the folks who follow you. I mean, you can try doing things like ads and hope that you go viral, but this is a guaranteed way to hit a lot of people. Another thing that letters to the editor and op-eds do is they tend to reach populations that aren't on social media as much, digitally disconnected, seniors, folks who tend to be pretty key voting constituencies, which just means that policymakers care about them. It's very transactional, unfortunately. And so it's a good way to sort of get those folks engaged in the issue. And again, I think I said this at the top, bringing attention to perspectives and events and issues that, didn't get their own news coverage. Another thing it does, which we tend not to talk about as much, is it shapes the thinking of journalists and editors and editorial boards themselves. So this speaks to that question a little bit. This is not going to change the way the media speak, but I think if we can be really persuasive and consistent about getting our voices into outlets, it does eventually very slowly kind of chip away at what may be a wrong-headed way to think about something, or chip away at both sidesism, or whatever frustrating thing that the media has been doing that is not what we want to be seeing, and we don't think moves any of us forward, either on the issue or on the things we care about in this country. Just a quick logistical difference. Letters to the editor are short, 150 to 250 words, and usually it's more like 200. When you're writing it, you need to get right to the point. What do you care about? Say it, get it out there. I often tell people when writing letters to the editor, it's fine if your letter is like a paragraph or less. We just want something in the paper that speaks to what you care about, what you want to see happen or change. Letters to the editor are a lot easier to get published because they come out every day. There are multiple letters usually in most major papers. And so as a sort of first response of getting into the media, letters to the editor are good. They're also good as a response to an article. So, if you read something that a journalist wrote that you thought was just completely off or egregious or was perfect and you really want to amplify it, letters to the editor are really good ways to do that, referring to an existing piece and responding to it. Op-eds are much longer, 600 to 850, sometimes 1,000 if you can really work with an editor words. But if you can say something in 850 words instead of 1,000, that's better anyway. It gives you more space to develop an argument, tell a personal story. For op-eds, it's more important to consider sort of who's writing the piece. They are very much influential, more so than letters to the editor, which are have higher volume. So, it may be a situation, and we see this often, where, you have the time, space, capacity, interest in writing an op-ed, but maybe you think about someone else who would be a good potential signer, who could take what you wrote, edit it, make it their own, and sort of be the person who is the author of the story. Maybe they're a better validator, is what we call that, for the story. It is definitely harder to get op-eds published. Opinion editors of papers decide what gets in, what doesn't. Speaking of shaping the thinking, they're the ones who kind of make the call on whether or not a guest editorial is written and is published, not written. So I think if you're trying to influence an issue, it is best to try and do an op-ed unless you feel it's highly unlikely that, one, you are going to have the time to write something long, or you think, this isn't going to get published because I saw an editorial or an op-ed about this, a week ago, 2 weeks ago. They're not going to publish another one. General rule of thumb is that both for letters to the editor and especially for op-eds, you need 90 days in between being published again. So if you had a letter to the editor published in the Post Gazette in October, you're not going to get another one in November or December, or probably even January. And that makes sense, right? We don't want to hear the same voices over and over again. Any questions about this?
I actually have a question about like timing.
Mhm.
Does it matter for like responding to an article, like, yes, about timing, like it came out last week, so you should try to get your letter in, the following week, or does it matter if you wait a month or, what have you?
It does matter, yes. One thing I think has happened over the last 4 to 5 years is that news cycles have sped up expeditiously, right? So you used to have a little more time for a cycle. A story used to have kind of, would ride a wave a bit. We are very much in a if not 24, maybe even 12-hour news cycle at this point. So, I probably would have answered that question differently 5 years ago than I answer it now. Now I think you do have a pretty short window to respond. I would say if it's really a niche thing and there was like a one-off piece about it, sometimes Ryan Dito writes about, transportation and cycling in a way that no one else does. I think there you may have a little more opportunity to take your time in responding. Although City Paper has kind of a weird um, you know, process for getting letters to the editor submitted anyway. But that aside, it is really important when you're working with the media to have a news hook. One of the things that we tell people all the time is if you're going to have an event or an action or a rally or a press conference and you want the media to cover it, try and have a hook, try and have it related to something that is currently happening in the news. Granted, that is harder and harder to do because the cycle is so fast, but it is always best to try and sneak into the cycle while it's still happening, or at least get on the tail end of it. Um, do I think if there was an article that was published a month and a half ago and you have the opportunity and interest in writing a letter to the editor that you shouldn't? I don't think so. I mean, I think it's worth giving it a shot. But yes, timing does matter, and if you can do it more quickly, that is certainly better.
Another question is for op-eds, when you are talking about like the importance of the author and the validator, is it, I guess it's a two-part question, but is it worth it to reach out to the editor and ask if your topic would be appropriate at this time to write something? And is it best to submit them from one person, or could like a bike ped group, for example, submit kind of like as like the bike ped group as a whole sending a message?
Second part first, because my memory is bad. It is fine to do a group editorial. Sometimes that's actually quite useful because it is representative of again, it's like one person equals many, right? So 5 people equals even more people. I would definitely not shy away from trying to get as many folks who can sign off on it as possible. It's a little awkward to write. As someone who writes op-eds almost every day, I can tell you that multiple voice can be a challenge, because if you have personal stories and you're trying to mix them in and there are like 5 authors, it's a little bit weird. But absolutely, bike ped groups should submit as a group if they want to do that. I wouldn't do that every time. I would mix it up. So, if you can get a good validator author once, do that, and then maybe the next time do it as a group. To your first question, which was, I think, asking ahead of time, that's changed a little bit over the years. It used to be that we would reach out to editors and say, would you publish a story about, this project in Highland Park that someone wants to write about? Now, and I think part of this is because of the speed of the news cycle, I almost always hear back from editors, I don't know, and I won't know until I read it. So, I think it never hurts to give someone a heads up. I don't think we're going to get solid answers. And in the end, I think we sort of have to write it regardless. And it isn't until it's written that we can really get a solid answer from the opinion editor. But the flip side of that is that there are so many other ways to use a written piece. Put it on a blog, amplify it on social media, put it on Medium, get it out there. It doesn't have to be that the only place this piece can get published is in the paper. There are also other papers. There are online papers that maybe it's not the Trib or the Post Gazette, but it's a smaller neighborhood paper, in an area where you're doing a project. So there are lots of options. You can't submit the same thing to multiple outlets, but you can say, okay, the Trib is not going to publish this, so I'm going to go to this other outlet. So I would say, in the end, it's just you might as well just write it and then try and pitch it.
Anybody else have a question? And thank you. Moving on.
That's it. We got through
it. Nice. Eric said, I've submitted a letter to the editor where the editor has come back and asked if I wanted to turn it into an op-ed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to share that just as another way that these things kind of develop. So sometimes you might submit a letter and they're like, this is a really interesting topic. Do you want to elaborate and build it a little bit more, and we can turn it into an op-ed? So just a suggestion.
Yep. And there also may be a time where an editor who is kind of particularly aware of pending issues or projects that are ongoing will reach out to a group and say, do you want to submit a guest column on this? And it doesn't always have to be that you are the one reaching out, but obviously you're the one pushing the agenda, and so most of the time it's going to be most beneficial for you to be the one pushing it to the paper.
I think
I was gonna sorry, I was just gonna say, I think in that particular case, I think because it did come from Eric Borer, like Pittsburgh, that probably helped them be like, okay, can you turn this into an op-ed? So I think that is also potentially applicable to a lot of our bike ped committees. If you do sign it as, Joe Schmo, Shady Side Complete Streets or whatever, they might be like, oh, okay, this is an organized group. Maybe we'll give you an extra voice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're seeing you as the expert, right? Which you are, but identifying yourself that way can help.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know a lot of people on this call and who are going to listen to this presentation have expressed extreme intimidation by the writing process. So I didn't know if you have any tips for getting started and just the writing in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's another thing that could be a whole separate presentation. But I would say always write an outline. And always start with a value. So one thing that is just critical is that you start with the world in which you want to live. You start with the value that you care about, and then kind of back up to that value with some of the facts. Most people who write want to tell the story in a very linear, chronological way, which makes sense, but it's not compelling in the sense that it is compelling to start where this is the thing I care about, right? Start with safety, start with that as a value. Everyone deserves the right to cross the street without fear of being hit by a car. Sounds extreme, but now you've got someone reading the story. And then kind of move on to what it is you're trying to do and why it matters. But we always start with a value when writing. Never take more space than you need to. You're just going to lose people, especially in social media world. People are so used to reading, one or two sentences and moving on. Get as much as you can in the initial part. So don't bury the lead. Start with what matters. Start with the value. Start with the thing that you want to happen. Everything after that may not even ever get read. So those are I would say three things. Those two. The third is don't use the opposition's messaging. So if you're fighting with an entity over a policy, no matter who that entity is, don't talk about it the way they're talking about it. Talk about it the way you want to talk about it.
I just, sorry, I was just going to add one thing really quick. I found it also, at least in our world, your suggestion for politicians to personalize it, but I also think that it's been helpful for at least what I've seen for people to personalize letters to the editor in some way as well. Like, this is my experience. I have a family, etc.
Always, always. Narrative. It's all about narrative.
We have a question from Armin, and then we'll go to Seth. So Armin
Okay.
says, I feel like I've seen more anti-bike lane letters to the editor recently. Is there a concerted anti-bike effort in the Post-Gazette LTE section, or am I just paying more attention now? I don't know. I don't know.
That I don't know.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything, but I've also noticed that. But I also feel like I've been more in tune also to, the bike beat or the transportation beat. So Armin, I can't exactly answer that.
One thing I'll add to that is that one thing that we have to our advantage is that anytime you mention the word bicycle, it adds clicks and it's clickbait. And so they often do like publishing stuff. And so, part of this whole thing is to get more people to send in pro bike lane letters because we know that the chances are often pretty good that they will publish. Now, with that said, like every time there's any kind of change, there's anti-bike stuff. The people who are opposed to change are more fired up often, so they might be sending more letters to the editor. I don't know the answer totally, but just putting it in a little bit of context.
Over to Seth.
So I kind of had a question. I was the subject, not the main subject, but Public Source published something regarding Dormont transit-oriented development. And that reporter has since moved on, and Dormont has now they're working towards changing their zoning. Is it best to follow up with that reporter, but they've kind of moved to a different role, or just kind of follow up directly with Public Source? And that's
Yes. Both.
The
Seriously. Yeah, as long as the reporter is, even if they've moved beat, as long as they're still at the same outlet, I would absolutely still follow up with that reporter, because reporters are all friends with each other, like all of us is friends with each other who we work with, or friendly, or acquaintances, or, colleagues who speak. So I would both reach out to the source, or I would both reach out to the publication, and whoever the new, if you know who the new beat person is, reach out to that person. If not, generally speaking, reaching out to like info at or letters at is not as good of a way to get coverage. So I would certainly follow up with the person who used to cover it and say, hey, we've got more stuff. Who's covering this now? Can you let them know to I really want to talk to them about this issue. I mean, just like everything, this is all about relationships. So use the relationships you have.
It's funny in this scenario, the reporters actually moved to Mount Lebanon Magazine, I think, as their editor, and I've also moved to Mount Lebanon, so I can be like, hey, Dormont's doing this. Mount Lebanon Magazine is just an extension of the borough. Why isn't Mount Lebanon doing the same thing in terms of transit-oriented development, which also kind of goes hand in hand with what we're trying to do as bicycle and pedestrian advocates as well.
Yep. That's something I didn't say, I think, in the presentation that I should have, which is, like everything, this is all about relationship building, and the better relationships we have with the media and with legislators and with any thought leader or person who has an opportunity to help enact policy, change opinions, the better, right? Pushing people as strangers versus pushing people whom is a much heavier lift.
Any more questions? Now's your time. Do people feel more empowered to get out there and start writing your letters to the editors and op-eds starting tomorrow or today?
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing I'll say is that we, as Sequel as a firm works with Bike Pittsburgh, and so we are always here to review anything that anyone associated with these groups write. We're happy to do a review. We're happy to utilize the relationships we have with the media to help you get something published. I mean, that's what we're here to do partially. So I don't know if that's something to talk to Anna about or Eric about, but like we are here. You might as well utilize us, and we do this with clients every day, all day. So by all means, if you write something and you want to get it into an outlet and you want someone to look at it first, just shoot it to me. I'm happy to do that.
Wonderful. Monica, I see you're unmuted. Do you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I'm mulling over a question. You mentioned twice, Jodi, not, I think it was in regards to the in-person interviews and the op-eds, not to basically bring up your opposition's arguments. And I guess in my mind, I kind of struggle with how do you take down someone's arguments without, counter punching, counter argument, taking this is how they feel, but this is the reality type thing.
Yeah, it's a tough thing to kind of get your head around, and I definitely hear you on that. One of the things that data shows, and there's been lots of studies, and I'm happy to share some of those with you after this, is that argument doesn't move people. So if you're trying to move the general public, having them read a piece where you're sort of going at someone else is not as likely to shift them as them reading you talk about why this issue matters and why it should be the way that you see it.
Mm-hmm.
So it might be helpful, I mean, it probably isn't, but it might feel helpful to talk to directly the person who has made this oppositional argument. But remember, when you're doing things like talking to a legislator or writing to the media, your purpose is to reach large groups of people. Large groups of people aren't going to be moved by two people attacking one another. They're going to be moved by hearing what your values are, hearing a persuasive argument for something, not against something.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Thank you.
I'll just add, thanks, Jodi. That's really good advice. I think a really good example, at least in our world, is like, do you want to argue bring up oh, they say that bike lanes are going to bring congestion. Well, I say that that's one less car on the road versus this bike lane will help me get to work safely. I think that the second is much more powerful when you talk about how that's going to help you personally and help improve your world.
It's always best to talk about the world you want to see, not the world that you're fighting. But I get that it's counterintuitive, and I also, enjoy a good clapback. So I feel you on that. But, if we're really trying to engage in persuasive writing and persuasive conversation, it's just better to talk about your values and the world you want to see.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance between you have to know your opposition's argument so that you can counter them, but you don't have to.
Oh, you absolutely have to know the argument. I'm
Yeah.
not suggesting ignoring it or not knowing it exists. I'm just suggesting that when you're proactively writing about an issue, talking about it in your terms, not theirs.
Yeah, got it.
Any more questions? That was a really interesting question, Monica. I hadn't thought of that, or I hadn't gotten to that thought. I'm sure once I sat down and wrote something, I'd be like, wait, what does this mean? But hadn't thought of it.
Yeah, it's tough. It's a tough concept for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know most of the topics that we would be writing about, or the projects that we would be writing about, are extremely controversial in the neighborhoods that they're going in, or like in the community in general. So that was a really good tip. Anyone else?
And it's fine if you don't have a question now, just feel free to email me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just about to say, Jodi put her email in the chat. It's just jodi@sequelconsulting.com. So please reach out. And if you don't get it, you can always reach out to me. This training workshop is recorded, so I'll be sharing it hopefully either later today or tomorrow at some point, and I'll also post it to the advocacy blog post, so you'll be able to find it online. It'll live there, and that's pretty much it. I learned so much. Thank you, Jodi, so much for coming. It was really
Yeah, thank you all for inviting me. It was fun.
Yeah, and thank you everybody for coming too. Enjoy the last 10 minutes maybe of your lunch break, and have a great rest of your day. So see you later.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yep.